Sometimes we as authors want to tell a story in a very different way. Sometimes the message we're trying to convey or the means by which we inform the audience has to break from the norm. I mean, maybe I want to make the idea of the rich feeding off the poor literal, and we make aristocrats into aliens that turn into like a silly putty and meld with each other in a weird, sexy orgy to devour the nutrients of normal folk. Well, we can do that. I'm author DC Ferguson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. Before we get started, I want to give you all a quick reminder. Subscribers to my newsletter are getting a copy of Cora Blake, Arcane Agent, for free. This story is a prequel to the Dragon's Dream saga, and a great chance to get started with the series. I linked the newsletter sign up in the comments. Make sure to sign up and get your free copy. And while you're at it, you beautiful person you, why don't you like me on Facebook? We'll make a blanket for it, we'll be best friends, and you get to see what I'm up to, get my books from the store, and all sorts of cool stuff. So, our first conversation on the topic is more of a caution. Many of the films and books that we're going to talk about are referred to as weird, confusing, hard to follow, avant-garde, and open to interpretation. Speaking for myself, I'd rather try to avoid words like that getting attached to my storytelling. If you're in my camp on that one, then the first advice I have for you is to slow down. Really consider that is this off-track structure or method of storytelling going to be the single best way to tell the story you want to tell. For every example here, I'm going to go as far as to say they literally couldn't have been done any other way. For as weird or strange or even as off-putting as some of these might seem, they also rank among my favorite books and movies. Abstract storytelling, just by its nature of being weird, is going to stand out in your mind. Thing is, it's rarely going to be food for the masses. Every time that there is a film like Inception, there are 20 movies behind it that are cult classics that could never find a mainstream audience. As long as you understand that these stories are not very marketable unless the conceit is exceptional, you are free to do whatever you want. So let's talk about the allure of abstract storytelling. Where does it make sense, and when would we want to utilize it? Well, the first thing is that these plots will typically have a pretty heady or intellectual conceit. Like I mentioned in the intro, and I swear, this is a real movie from 1989 called Society. The messaging can be clear, the execution can be, kind of gross, weird, and maybe even a little kinky. But the fact is that there is a message under this plot, and it lends itself to a sort of thinking person's film. But as Society shows us, that doesn't mean you have to think too hard. I mean, this is kind of low-hanging, creepy, weird fruit. Inception would be a better example, because the world building explains everything to us. We just need to keep it all in mind and keep track of who's in what layer of which person's dream. It's not overly complicated, but you can't casually have it on in the background and expect to keep up. So now that we know why we'd want to do this to ourselves, let's look at execution. Now, I'm going to cover the gamut from a little different to Velociraptor with a rocket launcher riding a shark levels of crazy. So, the first film we're going to touch on is also our first deep cut, the 1986 film noir Blue Velvet. This film, like a lot of the ones we're going to be talking about, are highly stylized. From the visuals to the depictions of characters to the scenarios and how they play out. There is a surreal quality to all of them, and this movie exemplifies that without jumping on the back of a shark with military-grade ordnance. The plot of the film is really simple on the surface. Jeffrey returns to his North Carolina hometown and gets caught up in the bizarre underbelly of the criminal world operating in his small, sleepy town. It has many of the classic detective beats, the femme fatale, the crime boss that's untouchable, but Jeffrey is no hard-boiled detective. Quite the opposite. He's so far out of his league that it's only because he's such a persistent and nosy kid that he gets wrapped up in anything at all. All throughout the film, there is this heavy symbolism with insects. Early on, we have a shot of an idyllic front lawn, and then close into the dirt to find it infested with bugs, which is a metaphor for how Jeffrey finds this criminal element hidden in his hometown. While the symbolism is pretty heavy-handed, the messaging is not. It tells a dark, simple story with a semi-typical three-act structure while being incredibly, weird. Maybe that's not right. Maybe the word is stylish. The thing is, Jeffrey is played to almost robotic discomfort in a very early performance by Kyle MacLachlan, who at one point was America's go-to guy when you needed a straight man in a really, really weird story. The femme fatale is cartoonishly throwing herself at the young man, while our villain, the always insane Dennis Hopper, isn't just evil, he is totally off his rocker. There are some amazing performances in this film, but because it's so stylish, you either love it or you hate it. It is a very polarizing film. But why? Well, at the time, it was a quote-unquote modern take on the 1950s concept of film noir. Updated for the mid-80s, now the criminals are drug dealers that rotted their brain on too much of their own product. And in place of the hard-boiled detective, we have a naive farm boy with more curiosity than good sense. Our femme fatale isn't a dame with a face that hides her ulterior motives. She's a sex trafficking victim trying to save her family from a crime boss. There's this dark, ugly film that covers all over everyone in this movie. No one is clean, and Jeffrey gets pulled down into the muck with them. This is a classic callback to those pulp stories, but the updated take trades away black and white and over-the-top performances for dull colors and surreal characters. Given that film noir was already a niche genre to begin with, this film almost seems like it was destined to be a cult classic at best, and so here we are, talking about the film 35 years later. But this is a great film to start your mind going down the path of different ways to tell stories. In particular, it's not that much of a deviation of itself, but in style, dialogue, and character development, it does get a bit strange. Other great examples, if you'd like to study this type of storytelling, would be the TV series Twin Peaks, and the films A Scanner Darkly and Natural Born Killers. Now, let's tell each other short stories that are all interconnected. I could have picked a number of different films that exemplify this method of storytelling. Top of the list probably would have been Pulp Fiction, but no. You know me. That's low-hanging fruit. If you're subscribed to this channel and you like my content, I can only imagine you've probably seen Pulp Fiction 40 times already as God intended. So, instead, we're going to take a look at a look-alike from Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino from around the same time period, but not as remembered. Oh yes, it's a second deep cut, but fear not, I even have more to come. I spoil you so. We're looking at the 1995 comedy Four Rooms. First of all, watch this movie once just to laugh your behind off, then go back and analyze it on your third or fourth viewing. The movie's conceit is there's this failing hotel that has some crazy stories going on inside of it on New Year's Eve. Tying all of our pieces together is Ted the Bellhop, played by Tim Roth. He goes from room to room in each of the stories, unwittingly getting dragged into whatever madness is taking place there, whether it be a witch's coven featuring Madonna, or a gentleman's bet involving cutting off a man's finger. Everyone in this movie is insane. They all have their own little worlds that they come from, their own stories and frustrations, and they all happen to be guests at the hotel on this one night. What the storytelling is doing isn't just weaving short stories together with Ted the Bellhop at the center of it. No. Just like Pulp Fiction, each story has some overlap into the others, and then there's this overarching story of Ted himself having the worst night humanly possible. Now, obviously Pulp Fiction does the overlap better and with more memorable characters. For example, when the boxer Butch ends up face to face with Vincent Vega, who was the star of the first story and the co-star of the bookends at the front and back of the movie. Thing is, though, Four Rooms isn't a crime caper. It's a comedy. What movies like these do is to try uniting a series of short stories under one umbrella and have a consistent theme running through it that ties them all together. Four Rooms moves chronologically through each story, and that works, but we also mentioned with Pulp Fiction, the timeline can be out of order as well. We see this done to some extent with The Witcher on Netflix, and we also see it done in the Marvel movies that have team-ups, such as the Guardians of the Galaxy or the Netflix series. What we're talking about is each smaller story bringing us even closer to a conclusion that unites or ties all of the elements together. As such, we often throw the three-act structure right out the window, but you have to make your climax knock it out of the park to feel satisfying. If you plan on trying this, my only word of warning would be to plan ahead. We're talking about, this level of planning, okay? Even though you're technically writing short stories, it's really part of a larger narrative, so make no mistake, you're still writing a novel. So the key to this, to writing this type of story, is that you're going for like mini 3-act structures in the short stories, all of them serving a larger narrative, usually a person or a being that moves between all of them and ties them together. But also, like we've discussed in this video, each one of our stories has to either be very, very different, or if they're very similar, the action needs to top the previous story. So, for example here, we've got Jason going on a killing spree. We meet this scene's victims, who are going to die because they have sinned together out of wedlock, and Jason is a very religious person. So, he kills them, of course, but the way horror tried to keep it interesting back then is always changing up the methods of killing them. Freddy did it too, and that is why so many of the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street sequels feel like tired retreads. It becomes a how are they going to die festival, until the overarching narrative of the virginal heroine comes in and destroys our big bad guy. I'd actually say those sequels are a perfect example of how not to do this correctly, but it also highlights where we can succeed because they fail so bad. So, now, let's tell everything out of order. So, again, if you watch the channel often, you know how often I will cite the 2000 film Memento as one of the greatest movies ever, and also a well of lessons on how to tell stories. Today will be no different. The type of story crafting that we're going for here is telling a narrative out of sequence, or with great deals of timeline confusion. With Memento, our main character and his wife were attacked. She's dead, and he's been left with a traumatic brain injury that doesn't allow him to form new memories. So every 15 minutes or so, when his brain clears short-term memory, he forgets everything. To keep track, he uses a notebook, and the really important stuff he tattoos on his body. He's trying to solve his wife's murder. Only, we start with him finding and killing someone. Then we tell the entire story backwards to see how we got there. It's a story about how fragile memory is, but it's also a crime caper, while also being a very intellectual film. Telling a narrative out of sequence is all about what you show and why you show it. For example, in the first chapter of Heaven's Crest, my main character is shot in the stomach, tied to a chair, and her antagonist is questioning her. I don't want you as an audience member to have a second to breathe, so I keep the scene as tense as I possibly can. As he's interrogating her, we flash back and go over the story that got her here. I do this again in the beginning of Act 2, filling in more information about the present. The audience can start to see the trajectory that the story is taking, but it's not clear how we end up at the scene from Chapter 1 until the drop of Act 2, which brings us to the present, and Act 3 is all about how Cora deals with her imprisonment. Now, I did this for a couple of reasons. First, the most practical reason is at the start of this story, Cora returns to her hometown after 14 years away. This is filled with drama and character development, and it is slow. And as such, there just isn't a lot of action to be found. So I start the book with a bang and a little mystery to keep the audience moving. The second reason is stylistic. I'm outright telling my audience, here, there is a crazy plate of action for you to eat, but the appetizer is some character development. And as promised, the third act is basically non-stop action and drama all the way to the finish. Now, Memento takes this and goes to the extreme, telling vignettes in chronological backwards order. The revelations that you get along the way would be spoiled if it was not done this way. And that's why it can't be done any other way. It takes a story with an interesting conceit and then leans so hard into it that you're just as clueless as our main character as things unfold. Like him, you don't know what you've forgotten until the next scene, and that changes your impression of the last scene, and so on. But DC, how can we accomplish such a monumental task of writing that beast? Well, guy who talks to your monitor, you should give yourself more credit. You really should. If you've watched this video, then you already know. If not, go back and check it out. Basically, what we want to do is have a full, and I mean full, concept of the story, start to finish. If you know the beginning all the way to the end, the hardest part is over. Now you just write it. The key to understanding Memento is that it isn't a complicated story. It really isn't. It tells the story it tells in a very unique way, one that could have blown up in the writer's face had it not been so masterfully executed. This might even be a bigger lesson to you, that your writing doesn't have to be overly complicated to be smart. It just needs to be done well. Last but not least, we are going to touch on the weirdest of the weird. These storytelling decisions were absolutely crazy, and whether they worked or not is entirely up for discussion. So, the first one I'm going to talk about is the 2009 Chuck Palahniuk novel, Pygmy. You might recognize this author as the author of Fight Club, so as you can tell, he is no stranger to mind games with his audience. Pygmy is an epistolary story, meaning the perspective is like that of a journal. We saw this with Bram Stoker's Dracula, and we discussed that epistolary format in our episode on perspective, so yay, go us. So what's so weird about this book? Well, it's told from the perspective of a child that has infiltrated the United States as a spy from a totalitarian regime. Thing is, this child is A, still a child, and B, does not speak English well at all. I mean, he really does not word good. In order to make headway through the book, you have to translate the broken English in your head. I'm not gonna lie, this book is absolutely hilarious, but it is a difficult read, with great lines such as, printed in English letter, word letter black against white label of bottle, English letter spell Listerine. I mean, that's how he describes a bottle of Listerine. Seriously. The book almost feels like a chore, but at times you're laughing so hard you can't put it down. The writer wanted to express the personal thoughts and exchanges between this child spy and his home country in broken English, and in so doing, actually does develop characters and give insight to our main villain, I guess you'd call him. It's a wild ride, but again, a huge chance taken. Next, and finally, we're going to touch on another deep cut, and this time it's going to be the 2001 film Donnie Darko, starring Jake Gyllenhaal. Remember what I said earlier about characters that are so stylish they come off as bizarre? Check, we got that one. How about seemingly separate stories that are interconnected by the main plot line? Yep, got that too. Story told out of order? Sure is. Deep symbolism and messaging? We got that in spades too. Basically, this movie does every weird thing a movie can do, and gets away with one of the best cult classics of any we've discussed so far. The reason this works so well for some, and is a weird piece of junk to others, is that the film never spoon-feeds you anything. If you want to understand it, you are forced to understand based on the context of what is taking place in the world, and the story never gives you a second to breathe. There is no aha moment in the film with a big revelation. When the climax comes, you either understand what happened, or you don't. Period. Even if you feel like you did understand it, you're probably still going to look it up on the web later to see if your interpretation was correct. That's pretty heady and awfully daring, which, as you can imagine, is more thinking than your average moviegoer wants to invest. As such, the movie is incredibly polarizing, but it was popular enough that you probably know some people that have seen it. Whether they understood it or not, that's another question. Basically, Donnie is a high schooler that narrowly avoids a crazy accident where a jet engine falls off a plane and crashes in his bedroom. The thing is, Donnie may be schizophrenic. He may be an unreliable narrator. So the events that follow may be him going insane, or he may be on a parallel timeline and seeing echoes of another one. The answer to all of it requires you pay a ton of attention throughout the film because every detail comes out in casual conversation. And like I said, it doesn't pause to reflect on anything or repeat itself. I would suggest watching this multiple times for both enjoyment and study. This is when abstract and intellectual meets art, and it really is a beautiful thing. Abstract storytelling is, more than anything, a refusal to conform to the norms and tropes of your typical structure. But there needs to be a darn good reason to do it. Remember, a lot of the examples we've discussed here require careful planning if you intend to pull it off. The rewards are great if you can, though, and you can take a simple story like Memento and make it into a piece of storytelling art by doing it in a way that makes it memorable. Once again, the donations from you guys are so awesome. Thank you so much. We're still working with the Boston-based Needs organization to get this beautiful lady a service dog. Her name is Liana. She's 11 and on the spectrum. This wonderful person is my little girl. And if you'd like to help out, there's a link in the comments below. Also, don't forget to sign up for my newsletter. The link is in the comments too. And you're going to get Cora Blake, Arcane Agent, totally free. You'll get cool news about what I'm working on in books and here on the channel, and it comes loaded with cool authors and promotions for fantasy and sci-fi. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos. And as always, I'm DC Ferguson. Now have fun and get crafting.